Major Thompson woke with a dull, insistent ache pressing behind his eyes, and the first thing he noticed was Jesica Rose standing quietly across the room. His mind scrambled to connect the pieces: the wine, the late night, the spinning blur of his own misjudgment. And yet there she was, not hovering, not intruding, just there. Calm, composed, her presence both grounding and infuriatingly intimate. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Jesica had been his maid for over a year, but this morning she was more than that. In the dim light of the penthouse apartment, though not a crystal chandelier or grandiose room, just the sleek, functional living space he favored, she carried a quiet authority that only came from knowing she had walked into his vulnerability and stayed without taking advantage. She had seen him unsteady, incapable of commanding his own body, and she had chosen to remain. That simple fact lodged itself in Major's chest with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He shifted on the bed, muscles stiff, trying to recall the fragments of the previous night. His usual control, the precision that defined every part of his life, had slipped under the influence of too much wine and too many suppressed distractions. Jesica's steady hands had corrected his imbalance, guided him safely through his haze, and then she had done the remarkable thing. She had stayed. Not in his room, not in his personal space, but near enough that he could wake and find evidence of her care. A neatly folded blanket on the couch, a pillow slightly indented, the faint scent of her perfume lingering just enough to remind him that she had been awake while he had been lost. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, painfully aware of how exposed he must have appeared to her. This wasn't embarrassment from the alcohol, it was something sharper, something rare. Respect mixed with desire, tangled in confusion. Jesica moved about the room as if nothing had shifted at all, her attention on small tasks, her expression unreadable. She was entirely herself, professional, attentive, poised. And yet, for the first time, he truly saw her, fully aware of the magnetic precision she carried in every gesture. Major walked toward the kitchen, his senses sharper now, noticing how her presence filled the space without intruding. She had made the apartment orderly again, every object returned to its place, every surface subtly touched by care, but she had not lingered where she wasn't wanted. That was Jesica Rose in a nutshell, discreet, dependable, unshakable. And this morning, after the night he had barely remembered, he understood how deeply her restraint and attention mattered to him. He thanked her not casually, not with the mechanical politeness he usually afforded staff, but sincerely. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes meeting his without flinching. She accepted it as it was meant, acknowledgement, not leverage, not flirtation. That silent exchange, small and unspoken, carved a new understanding between them. Something had shifted, unspoken but undeniable. The boundaries had not been crossed, yet a new line had been drawn in the quiet, charged way of things neither could name yet. The morning hours passed with minor movements and gestures, coffee prepared and placed with care, a soft pat of reassurance when he winced while tying his shoes, the subtle adjustments in the room that reminded him she had stayed to keep him safe. Not for duty, not for obligation, by choice. That realization unsettled him. Jesica went about her work as if nothing had changed, but she knew, as he knew, that the night had rewritten something invisible between them. It wasn't words. It wasn't an action anyone else could perceive. It was attention, presence, restraint, the kind that lingered in the spaces between people. And when Major finally left the kitchen to collect himself, the awareness remained. He could no longer see Jesica Rose the same way he had the day before. Nothing inappropriate had happened, yet everything had shifted. And for the first time in a long while, Major Thompson, the man accustomed to control and precision, understood a kind of vulnerability that couldn't be fixed with money or dominance. He had been seen, and she had stayed. That quiet understanding, that subtle, potent charge in the air between them, lingered longer than the headache, longer than the wine. By the time sunlight fully filled the apartment, Major and Jesica both knew something had begun. A slow, deliberate spark that neither could ignore. The next morning passed in relative normalcy, but the air between Major Thompson and Jesica Rose had shifted imperceptibly. It was subtle at first, almost like a vibration under the surface of everything they did. Major had returned to his office, pretending to bury himself in emails and calls, while Jesica moved efficiently through the apartment, tidying, organizing, and completing errands without speaking more than necessary. Yet each glance, each passing in the hallway, carried a weight neither dared name. A few days later, that weight manifested fully in the kitchen. Major arrived early, unusually so for him, to grab a quick coffee before a meeting. Jesica was already there, preparing breakfast for him as she often did when his schedule required it. The smell of fresh toast and brewed coffee filled the space, but neither of them paid attention. Their eyes met across the counter, and in that instant the rhythm of the house changed. Jessica's gaze held his longer than usual. It wasn't curiosity or judgment. There was something more. Something raw, something almost frightening in its clarity. Major felt a heat creep into his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. His usual composure wavered as he realized he couldn't look away, couldn't move first, couldn't force himself back into the habit of control that had always defined him. Their hands brushed as he reached for a cup, a fleeting contact, and the electricity in that brief touch left both of them still for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Jesica pulled back first, but the tension lingered in the space where contact had occurred, stubborn and tangible. Major swallowed, aware of the unnatural tightness in his chest. This wasn't attraction in its simple form. This was awareness of intimacy, recognition of trust, and the sudden, undeniable pull that came from being seen so completely. Neither spoke. Neither moved quickly to break the tension. Their routine continued, but every motion carried meaning. When Jesica passed the toast across the counter, her fingers just slightly hovered near his hand, the air between them charged. Major felt it, the almost imperceptible tremor of something building in silence. Every subtlety mattered. Days became a string of such moments. A shared glance over a countertop, a brush of hands while he collected documents. The way her hair fell forward when she leaned over to pick up a dropped utensil just so. Nothing explicitly provocative, nothing improper, but the weight of desire, unspoken yet undeniable, grew with each passing moment. He found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to. The curve of her jaw, the determined set of her shoulders, the way her eyes focused entirely on a task but softened whenever they caught his. Major realized he had been underestimating the power Jesica held. Not her beauty, though she had that, but her presence, her restraint, her intelligence. She did not need to seduce him to have influence over him. That day, in the kitchen, he understood how entirely she could command his attention without a word. Jesica, on her part, felt the same awareness but disciplined herself. She recognized the tension, acknowledged it internally, but maintained the professionalism that had always defined her. She had seen him vulnerable, yes, but that did not give her license to act on curiosity or desire. She had integrity, and for the first time, she recognized that Major's respect and attention carried weight far beyond money or status. He was aware of her, truly aware, and that awareness carried its own vulnerability, one she refused to exploit. It became a silent dance. Both moved through the apartment with the efficiency of habit, but the electricity between them grew with every eye contact, every inadvertent touch. It wasn't lust. Not yet. It was fascination, awareness, and the undeniable recognition that the events of the drunken night had created a shift neither could ignore. The memory lingered subtly in their minds, not the drinking itself, but the moments of quiet care, the restraint, the watchfulness, and the acknowledgement that someone had seen them at their lowest and remained without judgment. One evening, Major paused in the kitchen doorway, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, and Jesica froze mid-step. Their eyes locked, and the charged silence stretched long enough to feel like a living thing. Neither moved, neither spoke, yet both knew the world had narrowed to that one glance. Major felt the first real stirrings of something he couldn't label, something that made him acutely aware of Jessica's proximity, her presence, her very being. He became conscious of how she carried herself, how carefully she balanced poise and warmth, how impossible it was to ignore her now. Jessica noticed the shift in him, too. Not in fear, not in apprehension, but in fascination. There was tension, yes, but it was mutual, restrained, and alive. She had felt it before, but now it was undeniable. Every glance, every brush of his gaze across her face carried weight. The awareness that they could no longer function in simple roles, billionaire and maid, without the undercurrent of what they had shared, what had begun in silence and restraint, made her heart beat faster than she expected. By the end of the week, the charged eye contact had become a ritual neither named. It happened in the kitchen, in the hall, in passing. The world around them existed, but the space between them became magnetic. Each look, each pause carried a universe of recognition, and though nothing had been spoken, both Major Thompson and Jesica Rose understood that everything had changed. They hadn't crossed a line, they hadn't acted impulsively, but the first sparks had ignited, and the tension now thrummed through the house like a subtle heartbeat. Neither would speak it, but both were aware. Nothing would be the same again. The days after the charged kitchen moments carried a quiet, simmering tension that neither Major Thompson nor Jesica Rose could fully ignore. It wasn't just the memory of the night he had gotten drunk, nor the lingering awareness of how she had stayed to ensure he was safe. It was the weight of acknowledgement, of trust, between them. Every movement, every glance, hinted at something deeper, something unspoken, and yet neither dared to breach the invisible line without mutual agreement. Major noticed it first in the small routines they shared. Jessica would enter the room carrying groceries or coffee, and their eyes would meet briefly over the counter, hesitation lingering in that single fleeting contact. It was not a look of desire alone. It was a question, a careful measurement of boundaries. And he felt it too, the quiet, insistent pull that had begun weeks ago, intensifying with each day. He knew he had to address it, not with words shouted or emotions forced, but with precision and honesty. He found her one afternoon in the living room, organizing his paperwork and arranging files on his desk. Jessica moved with the calm efficiency that always drew his attention, but this time, the rhythm of her hands, the deliberate control in her posture made him pause. He stepped closer, careful to maintain the distance that still marked professionalism, and observed her. She looked up, awareness flickering in her eyes as though she had anticipated this moment. He took a deep breath. The control that defined him in the boardroom now served a different purpose. His voice was measured, low, precise. He asked the question he had been circling for days, whether she had ever felt uncomfortable during the night he had lost control. It was not phrased as accusation, not as guilt, not as obligation. It was a question of clarity, of consent, of understanding. Jessica's response was deliberate and calm. She reassured him that nothing had made her uneasy, that every choice she had made had been her own, guided by observation, respect, and care. Her honesty carried weight, both in its content and in the certainty of its delivery. Major recognized the magnitude of that moment immediately. She had been fully aware of the circumstances, fully able to choose her actions, and had acted with conscious consent. A sense of relief, tempered with an unfamiliar heat, washed over him. Relief because he had addressed a matter that could have poisoned the unspoken tension. Heat because he realized just how powerful the combination of trust and attraction could be. Jessica had not merely stayed that night out of obligation. She had chosen to stay, and she had affirmed that choice with clarity and agency. That affirmation, seemingly simple, reverberated through him in ways he had not anticipated. Jessica, in turn, understood the significance of his question. It was more than checking a box of propriety. It was acknowledgement of her autonomy and respect for the dynamic between them. She realized that Major Thompson's attraction, slow-burning, potent, careful, was now intertwined with a recognition of her choices. She felt a tension in her own chest, a growing awareness of the unspoken possibilities, but it was tempered by the same measured restraint she had exercised all along. The conversation left them both quietly aware of a shift that could not be reversed. The silent dance of proximity, the charged glances, the brief touches of hands, everything that had been building now had context. Every action, every pause, was now layered with consent, clarity, and mutual understanding. The awareness of one another had deepened beyond attraction. It had become a recognition of agency and desire coexisting without coercion. That evening, as Jesica finished preparing a tray of coffee and pastries for his late work session, they shared a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Their eyes met over the edge of the countertop, and neither looked away immediately. It was no longer just an accidental brush or fleeting contact. It was an exchange of unspoken understanding. Major's gaze carried intent, yes, but tempered with respect. Jessica's gaze carried recognition, curiosity, and choice. The tension hung thick between them, but it was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, conscious, and entirely theirs to navigate. For Major, the moment marked a turning point. He understood that the dynamics of desire and restraint could coexist with trust, that attraction did not necessitate crossing boundaries, and that the depth of feeling he had begun to recognize was intensified by the mutual respect Jesica had demanded and received. For Jesica, the awareness of his acknowledgement brought a sense of empowerment alongside the simmering attraction she had felt since the night he had lost control. She understood that her careful, deliberate choices were being recognized, valued, and respected. That alone was intoxicating, more than the lingering tension of proximity or the subtle weight of attention. By the end of that evening, the air between them had shifted subtly but palpably. Their movements were still professional, their interactions still disciplined, yet a new layer of intimacy existed, built on consent, clarity, and the undeniable charge of shared awareness. They were no longer simply billionaire and Maid. They were two adults, aware of each other, aware of the attraction, aware of the boundaries, and capable of navigating the space between with intention. The first real, deliberate conversation about consent had done more than clarify their past. It had deepened the unspoken tension and solidified the connection in a way that neither could ignore. From that moment on, every glance, every gesture, every shared silence carried a new meaning. The slow burn was no longer accidental, it was purposeful, deliberate, and poised to escalate as trust and awareness continued to build. It was a late afternoon when the moment arrived, unplanned and entirely unavoidable. The apartment was quiet, the city beyond the windows muted beneath the soft glow of early evening. Major Thompson had been reviewing reports at the dining table, his attention absorbed, while Jesica Rose moved carefully between the kitchen and living area, setting down dishes and adjusting the placement of documents he had left scattered. Their proximity, as always, was deliberate yet cautious. Each step Jesica took, each movement Major made, carried the invisible weight of awareness that had begun days ago. They were aware of each other, not in a casual sense, but in a way that made ordinary actions feel charged. And then it happened. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same glass of water. It was fleeting, nothing intentional, a mere accident, yet the effect was immediate. Major froze mid-motion, conscious of the warmth of her hand against his. Jesica paused as well, feeling the subtle electric current that shot through her at the contact. Neither withdrew immediately. It was as though time had slowed, every detail amplified. The texture of the glass beneath their fingers, the slight pressure of skin against skin, the rhythm of breath that had shifted in tandem with the small collision. Jesica pulled back first, her motion subtle but deliberate, a tiny step away that created space without breaking the connection entirely. Major observed her, noting how her chest rose and fell with measured control, the faint flush on her cheeks, the way her eyes lingered on his before she focused back on the task at hand. He respected the pullback, understanding instinctively that it had been her choice to disengage first. That awareness, that respect for her autonomy, made the moment far more charged than any intentional act could have. For a long minute, both remained in that state of suspended awareness. The mundane act of handling a glass had become a microcosm of the tension simmering between them for days. It was not desire in its crude form, nor impulse. It was recognition, a shared acknowledgement that attraction existed and that every interaction carried weight. Major felt his heart tighten, not with frustration but with anticipation. Jesica felt it too, a pull toward him tempered by the discipline she had maintained since the morning after. After the initial brush, the small accident lingered in their awareness. Major found himself stealing glances as she moved past, noting the sway of her shoulders, the careful rhythm in her steps, the way she seemed fully conscious of her presence in the space. Jesica, in turn, felt the subtle magnetism of his gaze without needing to meet it directly. Each awareness amplified the tension, adding layers to the slow-burning connection that had begun with that single night and had intensified with the deliberate consent they had established. Later, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the apartment, they found themselves in the living room simultaneously. Major was adjusting papers on the table. Jesica was straightening cushions on the sofa. Their shoulders brushed accidentally as she leaned forward, and again, both froze. This time, neither pulled away immediately. There was no speaking, no acknowledgement, just a silent, mutual understanding of the energy that crackled between them. Major realized something important in that moment. The closeness they shared was no longer accidental in its effect, even if the physicality itself was unintended. Every fleeting touch, every near collision, reminded him that Jesica held his attention completely, and he respected her enough to allow that awareness to exist without forcing it, without taking more than she offered willingly. Jesica, too, understood that the repeated accidental closeness was not a trap or a test. It was an organic unfolding of awareness, a subtle dance where both participants were learning the limits of tension and restraint. She felt the pull of his presence, the heat of his gaze, the almost imperceptible awareness of how aware he was of her movements. And yet she maintained her composure, understanding that this delicate equilibrium, the balance between attraction and respect, was fragile and precious. By the time evening settled fully into night, the apartment carried a new energy. Neither had spoken of the moments, and yet both felt their significance. The accidental closeness had crystallized the growing awareness of attraction between them. It was no longer theoretical or imagined. It was a tangible part of their interactions. Every glance, every brush of hands, every deliberate step near each other carried weight, building toward something neither could yet define, but both knew was inevitable if they continued along this path. As Jesica finally left the living room to finish tidying the kitchen, Major remained seated, hands folded over the documents before him. He realized that these small moments of accidental closeness were more intoxicating than any deliberate attempt at seduction could have been. They revealed a depth of attraction, a mutual respect, and an awareness that had been forged through restraint, consent, and careful observation. The evening ended without further incident, but the tension persisted. Neither had acted impulsively, neither had crossed a line, and yet the charge between them was undeniable. They had learned, through subtle gestures and fleeting contact, that the simplest moments could carry extraordinary weight, and both understood, silently and clearly, that the path they were on was no longer casual. It was charged, deliberate, and slowly drawing them closer with each passing day. The days that followed the accidental closeness carried a quiet undercurrent neither Major Thompson nor Jesica Rose could ignore. The tension between them had become more than glances or fleeting touches. It had evolved into a sense of shared awareness, a delicate intimacy that existed in silence. Major, usually composed and in control, began to notice it in himself. His thoughts lingered longer than they should on Jessica's presence, her calm efficiency, the way she seemed to anchor the space around her with effortless poise. It was during one late evening, as the city outside blurred into a mosaic of lights, that Major finally let himself confront the unspoken. Jesica was tidying up the papers he had scattered across the dining table, moving with the precision and quiet confidence he had come to admire. Major had asked her to sit for a moment, something he rarely did, and when she hesitated only briefly, he gestured toward the chair opposite him. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the quiet of the apartment punctuated only by the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. Major's hands rested on the table, fingers flexing slightly as he considered the words he had never spoken aloud. Jesica met his gaze, steady, patient, aware that he had chosen this moment deliberately. He began carefully, revealing a side of himself few ever saw. The vulnerability that had always been buried beneath wealth, power, and control came forward, not recklessly, not in confession, but in measured honesty. He spoke of the loneliness that accompanied his success, the weight of expectations, and the relentless pressure to maintain a public image while managing a private life that felt hollow at times. His voice was calm, but beneath the surface, there was a tremor of raw truth. Jesica listened without interruption. Her posture remained attentive yet relaxed, and she never offered false comfort or clichés. She did not attempt to fix him or dismiss his feelings. Instead, she allowed him the space to reveal himself fully, witnessing his vulnerability without judgment. Each word he spoke seemed to deepen the silent bond between them, reinforcing the tension and the awareness that had been building since the night he had been drunk and she had stayed to care for him. Major noticed her presence more acutely than ever before. Her eyes, calm and understanding, held him without pressing, without expectation. The faint tilt of her head, the way her hands rested lightly in her lap, the quiet steadiness of her breathing, all of it grounded him in a way he had not anticipated. Jesica had never needed to act on desire to have an impact on him. Her mere presence, her attentive care, had shifted something fundamental in his perception of intimacy. The conversation continued, unhurried. Major shared anecdotes of his childhood, the pressures from family and society, the moments of isolation hidden behind wealth and influence. Jesica responded not with words but with gestures, the subtle nod, the slight lean forward, the warmth in her eyes. These small signs of acknowledgement allowed him to reveal more, to strip away layers of control he usually wore as armor. In response, Jesica felt her own awareness deepen. She had always known Major to be composed, untouchable, and commanding. But here, in this quiet moment of shared presence, she saw the man behind the reputation. She recognized the humanity beneath the billionaire facade, the vulnerability that had been carefully hidden from the world. And in that recognition, a subtle intimacy formed, an understanding that transcended words and glances. Major, feeling the gravity of the moment, allowed himself to lean slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. The gesture was small but deliberate. Jesica noticed, aware of the space he was bridging, the subtle attempt at connection. Their eyes met again, and in that brief exchange, the tension that had been simmering in every accidental touch, every charged glance, became almost tangible. Neither spoke of desire explicitly. It was not needed. The vulnerability he shared, the trust she offered in listening, and the mutual awareness of the simmering attraction between them were enough. They existed in a space of restrained tension, where intimacy was built on acknowledgement, consent, and mutual respect rather than action. By the time the evening concluded, the emotional landscape between them had shifted irrevocably. Major Thompson, who had always relied on control and precision, now understood the power of presence, of vulnerability, and of trust. Jesica Rose, steadfast and perceptive, recognized the depth of the connection they were cultivating, not through impulsive acts, but through awareness, consent, and shared space. As Jesica left the room to finish her tasks, Major remained seated, the quiet hum of the apartment surrounding him. He reflected on the evening, on the words spoken and the unspoken truths acknowledged. The slow burn between them had intensified, fueled not by action, but by the courage to be vulnerable and the choice to see one another fully. In that subtle, charged silence, both understood that the path forward would be neither simple nor rushed. The awareness of attraction, the acknowledgement of consent, and the intimacy of shared vulnerability had created a tension that neither could ignore. And as they each moved through the apartment, performing their roles with careful attention, the understanding lingered. Nothing would ever be the same. The tension that had been building between Major Thompson and Jesica Rose reached a new layer that evening, quiet but unmistakable. The apartment was bathed in the soft, warm glow of lamps rather than harsh overhead lighting, giving every corner a sense of intimacy without words. Major had been reviewing his schedule, scribbling notes across his tablet, while Jesica moved around with her usual efficiency, arranging papers, straightening a chair, and clearing a few items he had carelessly left out. It was one of those moments where proximity became inevitable. They were both reaching for the same stack of documents, the brush of their hands intentional yet restrained. Major froze for a heartbeat, sensing the electric pull that lingered in that brief contact. Jesica felt it too, a subtle warmth traveling through her arm where his had touched hers. Neither pulled away immediately. This time the awareness was mutual, deliberate, conscious. Major's breath caught. He realized that restraint alone could no longer convey what he felt. There had to be acknowledgement, a way to communicate his growing fascination and desire without violating the space Jesica had carefully maintained for months. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low, measured, carrying both inquiry and intention. The words were simple, almost mundane, yet heavy with significance. He was asking for her consent, not assuming anything, not testing her boundaries. He was asking to share a moment of physical closeness that went beyond mere accident or brush, a deliberate, chosen connection. Jessica's eyes met his. In them, Major saw curiosity, awareness, and trust all rolled into a quiet intensity. She nodded almost imperceptibly, the faintest acknowledgement of permission. Her response was not flirtatious, not teasing. It was precise, clear, and entirely voluntary. That one gesture, the nod, changed the dynamic entirely. Slowly, Major rested his hand over hers, palm warm against hers, maintaining gentle pressure without encroachment. The deliberate weight of his touch was careful, respectful, yet undeniably intimate. Jesica did not withdraw, she allowed it, the connection neither rushed nor forced. Their fingers did not intertwine yet, but the space between them was charged. It hummed with anticipation, recognition, and the quiet intensity that comes from shared awareness. Time seemed to slow. The hum of the city outside became a distant backdrop, the mundane clatter of dishes and papers fading into nothing. Major observed every subtle movement, Jessica's steadying breath, the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes held his without wavering. He had always commanded attention effortlessly in the business world, but here, in this moment, it was Jesica who held it. Her composure, her willingness to allow him this touch without coercion, grounded him in ways he had never experienced. Jesica, in turn, felt the significance of the moment. She understood the power she held in simply choosing to allow the contact. She recognized the careful deliberation in Major's approach, the respect embedded in the question he had asked before any touch occurred. The intensity in his gaze, tempered by restraint, mirrored the tension she had carried silently for days. For the first time, the awareness of their mutual attraction was no longer abstract. It had a tangible presence, transmitted through touch, intention, and shared acknowledgement. They remained like that for several moments, neither speaking, neither shifting away. The deliberate touch was a promise of awareness, a negotiation of boundaries without words. Major felt the electricity in her decision, the conscious choice to allow intimacy without action. Jesica felt the weight of trust he placed in her acknowledgement, the way he deferred to her every step of the way. It was a new form of closeness, one neither had fully experienced before, yet both recognized as powerful. Eventually, Major gently lifted his hand, but the awareness remained. The apartment felt smaller, warmer, charged with the intensity of a bond that had grown slowly but irrevocably. Jesica resumed her task, but the connection lingered, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. They were aware fully of each other's presence, of the possibility that had been carefully nurtured through weeks of restraint, observation, and mutual acknowledgement. That night, as the apartment quieted and Jesica prepared to leave for her evening duties, both understood the subtle truth. Nothing needed to be forced. The deliberate touch had deepened the tension, intensified the attraction, and reinforced the understanding that consent, awareness, and mutual choice were now at the heart of every interaction. The slow burn between them was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, carefully nurtured, and undeniably present in every glance, gesture, and breath shared. Major watched her leave with a quiet awareness, his heart racing in a way that felt new and dangerous. Jesica's eyes lingered on him for a fraction longer than necessary, and that, too, carried meaning. The world outside the apartment continued in its usual rhythm, but inside, the charge of that deliberate touch had transformed everything. They were no longer simply billionaire and maid. They were two adults navigating an unspoken, intoxicating tension built on mutual respect, deliberate choice, and the undeniable pull of awareness. The apartment had fallen into its familiar rhythm by evening, quiet except for the low hum of city traffic beyond the windows. Major Thompson had returned from the office later than usual, carrying a folder of reports, while Jesica Rose moved with her usual precision, tidying the living space and ensuring that everything was in order. Yet, in the charged silence between them, the air felt heavier, thicker. Each step, each glance, each subtle movement carried weight. This time, the tension was intentional. Neither spoke, yet both understood it. Major lowered himself onto the couch with a careful deliberation that invited proximity without imposing it. Jesica continued her work, arranging cushions and straightening a few documents he had left behind. But her awareness of him, and his of her, had reached a point where even silence was suffused with electricity. They sat too close, not touching, not deliberately leaning, but close enough that the warmth radiating from their bodies brushed against one another in the soft glow of the apartment's lamps. Each subtle motion, the shift of a shoulder, the adjustment of a chair, carried significance. Major was aware of how her presence filled the space, how even the smallest gesture drew his attention. Jesica, equally conscious, noted the way his posture subtly invited proximity without pressure. The slow burn between them had evolved from curiosity into something more deliberate. They existed in a mutual recognition of attraction and restraint, each aware of the other's feelings without needing to articulate them. Major could sense the quiet tension in her movements, the barely perceptible pauses that suggested she was weighing the distance between them. Jesica, in turn, recognized the controlled energy in his gaze, the way he observed her without pressing, the silent acknowledgement that he respected her boundaries even as he longed to cross them. Time stretched. They did not speak, yet the air hummed with unspoken words. Every glance, every pause was a negotiation. They measured each other, testing limits through subtle cues and micro-gestures. A brush of her hand across a pillow, a tilt of her head toward him, a long blink. They were all charged with intention, both conscious of the effect on the other. Major's mind raced, not with frustration or impatience, but with an acute awareness of desire tempered by restraint. He realized that the slow burn, the drawn-out, deliberate tension, was more intoxicating than immediate action ever could be. Jesica had trained him to notice details, to honor subtleties, and to appreciate the depth of connection that could exist without crossing a line. Jesica herself felt the pull of this quiet intensity. The earlier deliberate touch lingered in her awareness, a memory of warmth, choice, and consent. It had unlocked something within her, a recognition of attraction that was tempered by trust, respect, and self-awareness. She moved carefully, aware of every step, yet drawn closer by the same magnetic tension that gripped him. For several minutes, they existed in this charged proximity, each acutely conscious of the other. The tension was not a source of discomfort but of exhilaration. They had learned, slowly, deliberately, how to inhabit the same space without rushing, how to acknowledge desire without demanding action, and how to deepen intimacy without violating boundaries. A quiet smile flickered across Major's lips, subtle but deliberate, and Jesica caught it. The exchange, small and wordless, carried more meaning than a conversation ever could. It was acknowledgement, recognition, and an invitation to continue navigating this delicate tension together. She responded with a faint tilt of her head, her eyes holding his just long enough to reinforce their shared understanding. Minutes passed like hours, and the apartment seemed suspended in a world of their own making. The soft glow of the lamps cast shadows that danced across their faces, highlighting features they had studied without acknowledgement for weeks. Every detail, the curve of a jaw, the set of shoulders, the warmth of proximity, intensified the awareness that had been simmering since the morning after. Eventually, Jesica excused herself to attend to other tasks, but the tension did not dissipate. Major remained on the couch, acutely aware of her absence yet filled with the lingering presence of her energy. The slow burn had shifted into a steady flame of anticipation, a silent promise that each interaction would carry weight, meaning, and the potential for deeper connection. That night, Major reflected on the way restraint, consent, and mutual awareness could amplify desire more than impulsive action ever could. Jesica, in turn, recognized the same truth from her perspective. Attraction was not simply physical. It was cultivated in silence, in proximity, in the careful balance of choice and acknowledgement. By the time the city lights flickered against the windows, both understood that the slow burn had achieved its purpose. They were no longer simply man and maid, employer and employee. They were participants in a deliberate, intoxicating dance of attraction, trust, and tension, aware that the spark ignited months ago had evolved into a force neither could ignore. The slow burn was not temporary. It was an ongoing current, a shared pulse, a tension that promised intimacy, understanding, and the possibility of something far greater, if they continued to navigate it with the care and consent that had defined every moment thus far. The evening had settled into a quiet lull, the city outside glowing with muted lights as if the world itself had slowed to accommodate the tension in the apartment. Major Thompson sat on the couch, reviewing a few notes he had brought home from the office, while Jesica Rose moved about with her habitual efficiency, tidying the table, adjusting cushions, straightening papers. The ordinary actions of the space now carried an extraordinary weight, charged with weeks of awareness, restraint, and unspoken attraction. For the first time in days, they found themselves sitting unusually close on the couch. It wasn't intentional at first. They had both gravitated toward the same space in a natural rhythm of proximity, but the effect was undeniable. The warmth of her presence brushed against him in subtle ways, a faint electric pull in the air that neither could ignore. Every small movement, every glance, every breath between them carried significance. Major sensed the moment. The slow burn, cultivated over weeks of observation, careful touches, and deliberate restraint, had built to this quiet apex. Jesica, equally aware, seemed to feel it too, the gravity of closeness heightened by every prior moment they had shared, the accidental brushes, the deliberate touch, the charged eye contact. This was the culmination of anticipation, trust, and mutual acknowledgement. Jessica's gaze met his, steady and intentional. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. In her eyes he saw recognition, awareness of his feelings, awareness of her own, and the willingness to act on both in a way that was deliberate and consensual. Major's breath caught slightly, not in fear, not in surprise, but in the acute awareness of how powerful that look was. The weeks of tension, the careful navigation of boundaries, had prepared them for this moment. "Are you sure?" he asked softly, a low, measured voice that carried both inquiry and respect. He did not assume, he asked. Consent had become their silent contract, the foundation of every interaction that had grown increasingly intimate. Jessica's response was a subtle nod, her lips curving slightly in acknowledgement. The wordless permission was enough. Slowly, deliberately, Jesica leaned forward. Major mirrored her movement, his eyes never leaving hers, his hands resting lightly on the couch between them, giving space while inviting proximity. Their faces drew closer, the world around them fading into soft focus. Time itself seemed to slow, the hum of the city outside replaced by the quiet rhythm of anticipation inside the room. The first kiss was gentle, intentional, fully mutual. Jessica's lips met his with care, not urgency, and Major responded in kind, confirming each movement with his own deliberate restraint. Neither rushed, neither pushed. The kiss was an acknowledgement of desire, yes, but also of trust, of choice, and of the understanding that this connection had been built slowly, deliberately, over weeks of shared awareness. They pulled back slightly, their foreheads resting near each other, eyes still locked, sharing the quiet intensity of the moment. The warmth between them was tangible, a combination of physical proximity and emotional closeness. Major's hand moved lightly to the back of her neck, hesitating, seeking permission once more. Jesica did not withdraw. She leaned slightly into the gesture, reinforcing the consent that had defined their interactions from the very beginning. Every small gesture, every intentional movement deepened the intimacy. It was not about rushing or yielding to impulsive desire. It was about acknowledging the weeks of careful restraint, of observation, of mutual respect that had made this first kiss possible. It was a reward of patience, a recognition of the slow burn that had drawn them closer with every accidental brush, every deliberate touch, every silent shared glance. The kiss ended, but the connection lingered. They remained close, their faces inches apart, breathing in sync, sharing a quiet awareness of the spark that had just been ignited. Neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary. The intimacy had been established, and the power of the moment lay in the shared understanding of what had just happened. Major's gaze softened as he finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "I've wanted this for a long time." Jessica's lips curved into a subtle, knowing smile. "I know," she replied quietly, her voice carrying the same weight of awareness and choice. The apartment seemed suspended in time, filled with a quiet energy that had been building for weeks and had now manifested fully. The first kiss was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of deliberate choice, mutual consent, and the slow-burn tension that had defined their relationship since the night he had been drunk and she had stayed by his side. As Jessica adjusted the cushions and prepared to move back to her tasks, Major reached out once more, lightly brushing a strand of hair from her face. She did not flinch. She allowed the touch, the intimacy, the acknowledgement of shared attraction and trust. The slow burn had reached a new level. The tension, the desire, and the awareness were now fully mutual, fully consensual, and charged with promise for what lay ahead. That night, as they both moved through their routines, the apartment carried a different energy, one of intimacy, awareness, and deliberate connection. They were no longer simply man and maid. They were two adults who had navigated attraction, respect, and trust, and had now shared a moment that bound them in ways neither could ignore. The days after their first kiss carried an invisible charge that neither Major Thompson nor Jesica Rose could deny. Everything between them had shifted subtly, yet profoundly. Their interactions, once professional with undercurrents of tension, now carried an unmistakable intimacy, one that required careful navigation. Major, despite the pull he felt toward Jessica, recognized the delicate balance they had built and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had spent years living in a world where influence and wealth allowed him to get almost anything he desired, yet this was different. Jessica was not a subordinate to be commanded or swayed by status. She was deliberate, perceptive, and fully aware of the power dynamics that existed between them, and that awareness made him hesitate. He found himself stepping back, not out of disinterest but out of concern. The more he desired her, the more he realized the potential risk of missteps. He began to measure his words, his gestures, even his proximity. Simple touches were replaced by glances, subtle acknowledgement rather than deliberate closeness. He wanted her, yes, but he wanted her freely, without any trace of coercion, influence, or misjudgment. Jessica noticed the change immediately. He was distant in small ways, not cold, not rejecting, but careful. His gaze lingered less frequently, his hand brushed past hers only by accident, and he spoke less in moments where intimacy had previously been implied. It was a shift, one that sent a quiet ripple of tension through her, but she understood the reasoning. Major was cautious because he respected her. He was holding back not from lack of desire but out of care and integrity. For Jessica, the tension now had a different flavor. She felt the restraint, the intentional distance, and it only deepened her awareness of him. She understood that the slow burn they had cultivated, the deliberate touches, the charged glances, the first kiss, had created a vulnerability that needed protection. She also understood that she had a choice in every step of their growing connection. One evening, while Major sat reading at the dining table and Jesica tidied nearby, he noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the way she hesitated before stepping past him, the faint tension in her shoulders. It prompted a surge of both desire and responsibility. Rising, he moved slightly closer but stopped before crossing the invisible line he had imposed. "Jesica," he began, his voice low and careful, I need to be honest with you." Jesica looked up, her eyes meeting his with calm awareness. "Okay," she said simply. Her voice carried no hesitation, only readiness to listen. "I want you," he admitted quietly, the words deliberate, unhurried. "More than I probably should, given everything. But I also know the dynamic between us, and I don't want you to feel pressured, manipulated, or obligated in any way. You deserve to make this choice freely. Always." Jessica's breath hitched slightly at the weight of his words. It was rare for Major Thompson to speak so vulnerably, to openly acknowledge both desire and restraint. She had known he respected her, but hearing him voice it aloud crystallized the magnitude of his care. She also realized that this honesty, this intentional distance, was not rejection, it was protection. "I know," she said softly, moving closer just enough to acknowledge the connection without breaking the boundaries he had imposed. "I also know I choose you. I understand the risk you're managing, and I trust that you're being careful for the right reasons. But I'm not a victim of circumstance. I'm aware and I'm willing." The words hung between them, quiet but potent. Major's chest tightened, not with frustration but with relief and anticipation. Jesica had acknowledged the dynamic, affirmed her autonomy, and reminded him that consent and mutual choice were now their foundation. It was a rare, delicate moment of clarity in a relationship layered with tension, attraction, and restraint. They spent the rest of the evening navigating this new equilibrium. Their interactions were subtle, hand brushes by accident, lingering eye contact, careful conversation, but the underlying awareness of mutual desire had never been more palpable. Every gesture was intentional yet restrained, every glance weighted with understanding, every silence filled with unspoken acknowledgement. Major realized something profound. Pulling away to protect her had not diminished the attraction between them. It had intensified it, giving weight to the slow burn that had begun months ago. Jessica's choice, her awareness, her acknowledgement of both the attraction and the boundaries, had created a dynamic far more powerful than impulsive indulgence could ever achieve. By nightfall, the apartment carried a quiet, charged energy. They were no longer simply man and maid, employer and employee. They were two adults navigating an intricate, intoxicating connection, aware of the tension, conscious of the desire, and deliberate in their every interaction. Major's restraint had become an act of love as much as self-control, and Jessica's trust had reinforced the bond they were cultivating. That evening ended with a shared glance across the room, longer than any previous glance, holding a promise that while he might pull back to protect her, the fire between them was far from extinguished. Desire, trust, and awareness had intertwined, creating a tension that neither would deny. The days following Major Thompson's deliberate restraint were quieter, yet the tension between him and Jesica Rose had never been stronger. The slow burn they had carefully cultivated, the accidental touches, deliberate gestures, lingering glances, and first kiss, had built a foundation of awareness, trust, and mutual respect. Every interaction was measured, every look meaningful, and every shared silence a heartbeat of desire held in check. Jessica moved through the apartment with her usual calm precision, arranging papers, straightening cushions, and ensuring everything was in order. Major watched her from the couch, his gaze soft but deliberate. He felt the pull of attraction stronger than ever, tempered by the awareness that consent and choice were paramount. He did not approach impulsively. He waited. He observed. He honored the delicate balance they had established. When she glanced at him, their eyes locked, and a subtle understanding passed between them. It was more than acknowledgement, it was mutual desire tempered by patience and awareness. Jesica walked slowly toward the table where he had set a cup of tea, and for a brief moment their hands brushed again. This time neither flinched, neither pulled away. The space between them was electric, charged with the culmination of weeks of tension and careful observation. "Jesica," Major began, his voice low and deliberate, "I need to ask something, and I want you to answer only if you truly feel ready." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "I want us to move forward to explore this connection fully, but only if we're both sober, aware, and on equal footing. Are you willing to do that?" Jessica's gaze softened, a faint smile playing on her lips. She understood the depth of his question, the weight of responsibility, the acknowledgement of boundaries, and the respect for her autonomy. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady and deliberate. "I want that too. I choose this and I choose you, but only because I'm certain, not because I feel pressured or obligated." Major felt a wave of relief and anticipation. Her words were more than agreement, they were affirmation, mutual decision, consent, trust. All the elements they had carefully nurtured over the past weeks had converged into this single, quiet moment. He reached out slowly, placing his hand over hers on the table. The gesture was deliberate, respectful, and fully consensual. Jesica did not withdraw. She allowed the contact, reinforcing the understanding that this connection was built on choice, awareness, and shared desire. Their fingers did not intertwine hastily. The intimacy was in the acknowledgement, the weight of the decision, the careful progression from tension to action. Time seemed to pause. The apartment felt warmer, smaller, more intimate, as if the universe itself had slowed to honor this shared understanding. Major's gaze softened as he studied Jesica, noting the subtle tilt of her head, the gentle warmth in her eyes, and the quiet confidence she exuded. She, in turn, observed him with the same intensity, recognizing the care, restraint, and genuine desire in every movement. When he leaned closer, Jesica met him halfway. Their foreheads rested together briefly, a gesture of trust and acknowledgement rather than urgency. The slow burn that had defined their relationship, the accidental touches, deliberate proximity, emotional vulnerability, and mutual restraint, had finally found its full expression in this quiet, intentional closeness. They spoke little, not needing words to convey the depth of their feelings. The shared understanding was enough. Desire balanced with respect, intimacy tempered by consent, attraction intertwined with awareness. For Major, this was more than a kiss or a touch. It was the culmination of weeks of restraint, observation, and emotional honesty. For Jesica, it was the reward of careful choice, mutual acknowledgement, and the certainty that she was being seen, heard, and valued. The rest of the evening unfolded slowly. They moved together naturally, side by side, sharing moments of closeness without rushing, allowing their awareness of each other to guide every step. A touch on the shoulder here, a gentle brush of the hand there, each gesture deliberate, consensual, and meaningful. The tension that had simmered for weeks now became a shared rhythm, a dance of anticipation and mutual understanding. By the end of the night, Major and Jesica had created a new dynamic, one where desire and restraint, attraction and consent were in perfect harmony. They were no longer simply man and maid, employer and employee. They were partners in mutual awareness, co-creators of intimacy, and participants in a slow-burn romance built on choice, respect, and shared desire. As they finally settled into the quiet of the apartment, hands still lightly touching, eyes meeting in a steady, intimate gaze, both understood that this was only the beginning. The mutual decision to move forward with awareness, consent, and equality had transformed their relationship from tension-filled proximity into something deliberate, intoxicating, and entirely their own. In that moment, Major Thompson and Jesica Rose were no longer navigating uncertainty. They had chosen each other fully, consciously, and without reservation. And for the first time, both felt the true weight of what had been building all along, a love defined by respect, fueled by desire, and sustained by choice.